My name is Sarah Oxford, and I'm joined by my colleague Carmen Schroder, and we will be speaking to you for the next 30 minutes about an introduction to conducting safe research for participants and researchers. I'd like to begin, however, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that we're on, the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation in Naarm, or Melbourne, and I'm calling in from Geelong, where the Wadawurrung people reside. So I'm really thankful as a migrant to be able to live and work here in Australia, and I want to pay my respects to elders past and present. I also want to warmly acknowledge and welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are with us today. For those who may not know too much about ISCA, we are a research institute at Monash University. We've worked in partnership with WorkSafe Victoria for 16 years, but we also conduct applied research and evaluations for industry, nonprofits, and government on topics under the banner of work health and safety. If you have questions as we speak, please put them in the Q&A below. We probably will only have time for 1 or 2 questions, unfortunately, because we have a lot to talk to you about. But please put them there. It'll give us stuff to think about. And if you want to talk to us further, please reach out to us. So we are going to aim to address 3 things today. Next slide, please. The first Carmen will speak about is what is safety and why does it matter? Then I'll talk to you more about developing our safe research guidelines. And then Carmen and I will both talk to you about the guidelines in action. So what are the protocols that we can apply to bring this to life? So now I'll pass over to Carmen.
Thanks, Sarah, for that lovely introduction. And thanks, everyone, for joining us today. So I get to talk to you a bit about what is safety. And I think we've all heard this word safety, and it all gets talked about a lot. And so I just want to break that down a little bit before we really jump into the presentation. So when we talk about safety, often we're talking about the physical side of safety. So that's kind of freedom from any direct threats or any kind of direct bodily harm. And this can range from anything like, physical violence, aggression and verbal abuse through to, tripping hazards. You know, how we talk about safety in workplaces, we might talk about tripping hazards or other kinds of hazards in the workplace. More recently, though, we've started to think about this idea of psychological safety, and that's something that we're really trying to think about in our workplace at the moment. And so in terms of psychological safety in the workplace, it's become quite a defined concept. There's a lot of research into it at the moment. So the definition of psychological safety in the workplace is an individual's perception of whether they can express themselves, share ideas, take interpersonal risks without fear of embarrassment, rejection, or retribution. So psychological safety is really, it's more than a nice workplace. And it's more than no kind of conflict, because sometimes conflict can actually be quite a good thing. It can help bring things to the surface, flesh ideas out, and really get some understanding happening in the workplace. So I also want to take this concept of psychological safety in the workplace a step further and have us really think about being valued and what can encourage us to kind of speak out and share ideas. So it's not just the fear, it's actually what can encourage us to be present and contribute in our workplaces. And then at ISCRR, when we started thinking about psychological safety in the workplace and why we wanted to do this work and make our workplace safer, we started thinking about trauma-informed models. And safety is one of the key principles underpinning trauma-informed practice or trauma-informed approaches. And then we started to think about, well, what is safety in terms of trauma-informed practice? And really, it's quite intertwined, the physical and the psychological safety, when you talk about definitions in trauma-informed care. But with some of our research, we really found that a lot of people started talking about psychological safety, and they wanted to be physically safe, but there was this, because of their trauma survivor and their trauma experiences, they had this kind of concept of psychological safety. And so this is an individual's perception of whether they feel emotionally, socially, physiologically secure and respected without fear of judgment, harm, or re-traumatization. So there's a lot of overlap between those two definitions. But I would say the trauma-informed kind of definition of psychological safety really relates to kind of a basic need of safety, like the need to feel safe, just to function daily and to be able to participate just in daily life rather than the actual workplace and contributing in a workplace. So today, when we talk about safety, we're really talking about these psychological aspects of safety, both in the workplace and both in a trauma-informed way. So why does conducting safe research matter? So the first probably key reason that brought us to this idea was best practice and the growing recognition of the value of lived experience in research. So this can be either working with people with a lived experience of trauma or mental ill health as participants, or even collaborating in co-design kind of work, or maybe even having a colleague that's a trauma survivor. And the implications of this growing recognition and need to work with people with lived experience is that we have a moral and ethical responsibility to avoid re-traumatization and harm. And it really needs a thought out and thoughtful process to make sure this is happening. The next reason is worker wellbeing. So you may be aware that the rate of mental injury in the workplace is going through the roof at the moment. And working on psychological safety is one way to reduce the risk of mental injury and increase staff retention in the workplace. Quality research is another reason. So increased psychological safety is linked to increased innovation and collaboration, and this can enhance data validity and research outcomes. So it can really benefit your research to think about psychological safety. And lastly, there's a legal duty. So psychosocial hazards, which we'll define a little bit later, are now recognised under workplace safety legislation, and employers must identify and manage psychosocial hazards. And again, psychological safety in the workplace is another way of doing this. So how did ISCRR get to where we are? In line with best practice, we have been working with more vulnerable populations, both with our research interests and the need and demand, but also through our lived experience protocol and policy. We've also been doing a lot of research on psychosocial hazards and mental injury. And through that research, we realised we weren't really practicing what we preach. So we really wanted to try to apply it and apply it in a really thorough way. In that process, we did a bit of trauma-informed training, and then our researchers who work face-to-face with more vulnerable populations did suicide intervention training. And through that, we realised that we had some great skills and some great knowledge, but there was nothing really comprehensive. And so we really started to look at a comprehensive and proactive approach rather than these reactive kind of one-off measures. I'll now hand back to Sarah to talk about how we developed the guidelines.
Thanks, Carmen. So this process actually began over 12 months ago. I think when we're pulling these slides together and talking about it, it sounds very clean, but it's actually quite iterative, messy at times. We had lots of really great discussion. If you go to the next slide, you can see that what we did was we developed these guidelines taking trauma-informed approaches, using an occupational health and safety lens, drawing from best practice in research and ethics. And then we met monthly and continue to meet to reflect on our experiences to make sure that this is a document that's continuously improving and that it's meeting our needs as researchers. So as staff, we continue to engage with this. It isn't something that's a one-off exercise that you do. We need to make sure that we're still using it. And many of these things, I would say we're doing well, but some of them we aren't, and we're still working on. So I don't want to sound like we're just preaching that we're perfect. It is a work in progress for sure. We also took an institute-wide approach. So this really was driven by staff. So bottom up, staff saying, whoa, our research is becoming a bit more intense in ways. We need to make sure that we are thoughtful, that we are supportive of our participants, that we're prepared in case something does go awry. We recognize that when we created these guidelines, we needed to keep the staff in mind. We also need to keep participants in mind, but we needed organizational backing. We need resources and support to bring this to life. So we did take an institute-wide approach. The guidelines have 5 sections. The introduction discusses our core commitment, the context of ISCA, and key concepts. So it's really ISCA specific. We then address governance and culture. So we look at decision-making, mission and values, policies, and HR. So you can imagine it's a pretty big microscope on your work environment and your processes. It addresses leadership, style, skills, and knowledge, and organizational change. Now, each of these things has topics for discussion that we want to make sure we're following underneath. And then it has a column where it says lead. So it's who's responsible for leading this at ISCA. And then next to that is accountability. So who is actually accountable to make sure that that is being done. We then get into participant safety. So this, and we're going to talk about the protocol specifically to this in a minute. This just addresses things like cultural safety, ethics and consent, research design and practice, researcher knowledge and skills, and participant choice and empowerment. And we also, within these protocols, want to address staff well-being and safety. So This addressed standards on work environment, job control and design, exposure to traumatic content, support systems, supervision and performance, knowledge and skills, and staff recruitment and onboarding. Finally, and the stage we're in right now, is really making sure that we evaluate and improve and revise the guidelines as we go along. So we're creating a working group to do this. In terms of protocols, I'm going to talk to you about two today, briefly. We developed an interview protocol for working with people from vulnerable backgrounds on sensitive topics, essentially. We want to make this as practical as possible. So you can see that the protocol is designed with 3 steps: before, during, and after. So before the interview, we want to consider participant characteristics. What do we need to do differently to make sure that participants may be from, if English is their second language, or if they've experienced trauma, what do we need to do to make sure they have agency in the project, in the work, and they feel comfortable and we aren't re-traumatizing them in this process. So we want to give them choice, and we want to take their specific considerations seriously. We will also want to make sure our staff are prepared so that they have the supports available when needed. So we ask staff, and this is a checklist to secure support, to allocate time, to review protocols. During, we want to make sure that support is provided on introducing the session, handling sensitive questions, and responding to signs of distress. So we want staff to have prompts as reminders to check in with participants. And we also draw from our trauma-informed training and our suicide first aid training with suggested scripts of things that staff can lean on if things start to get a bit challenging. And staff also know that they have someone they can reach to on the team to step in if needed as well. And then after the interview, we want to ensure that participants leave with support numbers. We know that distress can also often be latent, so we make sure that participants have that information and support options available. We also want to make sure that our staff are supported too. So we engage in debriefing with our staff, and we support staff to do particularly challenging interviews at times that are best for them. We don't want them to take that hard interview into their evening. And to do something that can really separate themselves from the interview, for example. So maybe they need to go for a walk or just get away from the workspace for a bit. So next slide, please. So that was the first protocol, really quick and dirty of that protocol. The next one is our lived and lived experience protocol. So as we've said, we regularly conduct research with injured workers, people on compensation, people from diverse backgrounds. And this protocol helps us build respectful, consistent, and meaningful partnerships. That's the aim of it. We distinguish our types of engagement with people in research in this protocol. So it could be a partnership. For example, with migrant communities, we partner with the Migrant Workers Center. Or it could be someone with specific lived experience, maybe of a mental illness. We might say, will you come work with us on this project as a consultant? Will you review the language we've used in this survey or help us analyze this data to make sure that we're hitting the mark? And then the purpose is really to guide researchers through planning, implementing, and reviewing engagement, to build these respectful partnerships, and then to make sure we have checklists that we've done everything as best as possible to best practice. So on the next slide, we talk about how we really put this into practice. So in pre-engagement, we identify the expertise that's needed. We assess the time commitment. We begin conversations around expectations and remuneration for people we're working with. When we get more to introductions, we clarify roles and topics and communication preferences and really talk about practical considerations like confidentiality, ethics, where does the IP land? And this is where we start to sign formal agreements. And then during engagement, we follow these agreed processes. So we've already had some, sometimes hard conversations up front or worked through the nitty gritty with people to make sure that we're on the same page and we're really working as a team when we work with people with lived experience. And then post-engagement, we debrief. We want to get feedback to see how we can improve. And most importantly, we want to keep people informed about how their contribution will be used in publications or outputs or not, if it's not possible. So I hope what you've gathered from these 2 documents, the interview protocol and the lived experience protocol, is it gives our staff a structured, respectful, trauma-informed approach to conducting sensitive research. So now I'll hand back over to Carmen.
Thank you, Sarah. So I'm going to talk a bit about how we use these safety guidelines to really support staff and what it looks like in practice. But before I do that, as I said earlier, I wanted to explain what a psychosocial hazard is. So a psychosocial hazard is anything that can cause psychological harm. There's 8 examples here, but these are by no means the be all and end all. There are a lot of different frameworks to approach psychosocial hazards. And there's plenty of defined ones that you will see consistently across these frameworks, but there's a lot that aren't defined. So it's really important to think about what's happening in your workplace, what's relevant to your workplace, and what you need to address in your workplace. So some of the examples here, job demands is one of the probably the most common one that we hear when we talk to any workplace. And job demands usually relates to high workload, but interestingly enough, low workload is also a psychosocial hazard. Job control is another example. Job control, Sarah gave an example before about encouraging our staff to not engage in traumatic content at certain times of the day. So you're not taking that home with you, you might be doing it earlier. But job control can also relate to the diversity of your tasks and what your choice in what you work on and when you work on it. Support is another example, which I'm sure we are all aware of, but it's actually probably one of the most common examples that come up when I talk to workers and I say, what would you like? What would make you feel better in your workplace? And they all say better support. So that's something we've really thought about at ISCRR, about what we can do about better support. The others I won't go into right now, but I will highlight traumatic events or material, and that's something that's really come to the fore with us as we work with more vulnerable populations and do more work with lived and living experience experts, that we are hearing more traumatic content, we are exposed to more traumatic content. So we really thought at ISCRR about how we could address this and how we could support staff with this. And luckily we have done a lot of research in this with other organisations, so we were able to translate this to some applied examples. We also thought a little bit more about what this trauma kind of content meant for our workplace. And this is where we started looking at emotional demand related hazards. So there's 3 categories here that I've got. The first is trauma related. So the hazard here, really, the terms for them is vicarious trauma or secondary traumatic stress. If you go through the literature, there is a lot of debate about what is what and the definitions, and I won't get hung up on those now. But basically it relates to cumulative or immediate distress as a result of repeated exposure to traumatic content. So that might be images, it might be direct disclosures from participants, it might be reviewing audio-visual content, or even notes or research reports that have traumatic content in them. And when people are experiencing vicarious trauma or secondary traumatic stress, you will see symptoms similar to PTSD. The next category is exhaustion related, and these really relate to compassion fatigue and burnout. So compassion fatigue is related to cumulative exposure to kind of people's need or distress, and it can really happen slowly over time, and it happens across a lot of professions. Burnout is more about cumulative exposure to high stress, and I'm sure it's not a new term to most people here, but basically some of the symptoms of these 2 hazards are exhaustion, detachment, or reduced capacity. And lastly, we have this values-related hazard of moral injury, which is really being talked about more and more in the research at the moment. And there's 2 forms of moral injury, betrayal and transgressive. So betrayal relates to more an interpersonal betrayal of kind of forcing someone to betray their values or their morals. Whereas transgressive ones relate more to the system. So it might be lack of resourcing or silencing participants or things like that. And some of the kind of indicators of moral injury might be guilt, shame, or loss of faith or trust in the system or people. So when we thought about all these hazards, and we kind of, through our reflective practice, we slowly talked more and more about what it meant to do our work and what it was kind of, what impacted us and where we'd like more action happening and more support from the workplace. One of the things we came up was job demands, and that won't be a surprise to anyone in academia that job demands can be quite high. So we've got that one of our standards is that all staff workload is actively reviewed and monitored. And so that doesn't really sound very revolutionary, but as Sarah was saying earlier, that we have a lead and accountability allocated to each of these standards. And on this standard, the lead is actually staff, because we want staff to take the responsibility of saying, hang on, my workload is too high. And we want them to feel safe and to be acknowledged when they're saying their workload is too high or too low, and that it's actually their manager then, if they're accountable for making sure something changes. So we wanted that really clear to all of our staff that that's happening. Another way that we try and make sure workload is actively reviewed and monitored is through the way we fund and design our projects. And we're trying to keep these guidelines in sight when we do design our research. They are very new, so how this works long term, we're still testing and monitoring. Another example is through job control. So as Sarah gave that example earlier, that the exposure to traumatic content is limited to certain times of the day. The research shows it's not great to listen to something just before you go home, so don't do it at that time of the day. There's also examples across other professions of having trauma-free days. So they have trauma-free Friday, for example. And that's something we look at depending on the project and the level of exposure that people are experiencing. We're also trying to give our staff a choice on topic, and obviously this is limited on the funding we get and the research that we've been asked to do, but it is something that we're putting out there that where possible, please speak up about what you want to work on and how you want to work on it. In regards to support, we've really taken on board the idea that people like tailored support. So not everyone wants a certain style of support, or not everyone will engage or benefit from specific support. So we try not to mandate too much, and we try to instead offer an array of different styles that are kind of happening. So we've got things like staff matching. So on the more complex projects with high exposure to traumatic content, we try and have 2 experienced staff members on those projects, so then we can either remove people from them on and off as we need to, but also so they can support each other. As Sarah said, we also have regular reflective practice. We've got supervision embedded, and then we have project debriefing on our projects that are either going long term, that have high exposure to kind of complex or traumatic content. And lastly, we've really thought about our understanding of traumatic content, events and material. So we're really trying to educate our staff, which we are benefited through our research, that we're able to learn through our research and sharing our research among our staff. So there is a high awareness and high knowledge among us. And then we're also trying to embed debriefing following exposure, like Sarah gave those examples in the protocol, and then schedule debriefing as needed. But again, it's tailored to each project and to each staff member. So that's kind of our recap of what we've got for you. That's our cap of what we've got to do. As Sarah said, it's quick and dirty because there's a lot in this. It took us a long time to get to this point, but we thought it was really important to share because it might help people get started. We've also organised a workshop coming up in October. So if anyone's interested in learning more about this, where we'll do a bit more applied work and really flesh through some of these ideas with people to help them set their own safety standards or guidelines for their research or their workplace. So if you're interested in that, please do follow this QR code, or there's a link there. I don't know if anyone can put the link in the chat quickly. But yeah, we'd love to have you there and to talk about this some more. I might throw to questions.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm just looking at our chat. First question, I'll send to you, Carmen. What was most challenging about this process?
Thanks, Sarah. I think for the most challenging parts, there was probably the getting started. I think I really, I'd done a lot of research in this, and there's a lot of options and variety out there. There's a lot of research out there, but not much is tailored to the context. So it's really hard to apply it to your work context. And so the getting started was really, really challenging. And also that idea, I think, when you know a lot about something, and this is probably quite common in academia, that idea of getting it right and being perfect. So I think the reflective practice sessions really helped getting that rolling, and also our willingness to try. So we started with some kind of literature reviews, and they were really, really, really helpful for making sure we had all the knowledge we needed. But then we needed some really applied, clear steps for how to actually implement all this action. So that was probably the most challenging part, but then also allowing that process to flow was really, really hard. I don't know if you've got more to say on that, Sarah. Like, it was really valuable. I think when I go back to some of the people that we did the reflective practice with, they're like, I've never been more engaged with a set of guidelines before. But it was really hard to let that process flow.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And from a management perspective, hearing how people interpret things and how everyone was interpreting things differently, and then coming to the same page was really helpful. Like, the process is so important in this to make sure that everyone's on the same page. So those reflective practice sessions, sometimes they felt challenging, exhausting, but were so important. And I think we all came out of that a bit more confident in what we're doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. The next question, I'll take a stab at it first, Carmen, then I'll hand to you since we can reverse it. Can you give an applied example of how you've used a lived experience protocol? Yes, we've used this in different ways. So we have a PhD student doing a project on functional neurological disorder, and we wanted to make sure that when she conducts her interviews, that language is appropriate, that she's prepared in case any challenges arise. So we have worked with 2 consultants, people with lived experience of FND, and they've come on board and helped review the ethics application, review the interview questions, and they'll also help with data analysis to make sure that the project results can really positively impact the community, to make sure that the community voice is embedded in the project. So that's one example. We have also have created a partnership with the Migrant Workers Center. So we are doing a few projects now with migrant workers whose voices often go unheard. The Migrant Workers Center have ambassadors that they train to go into community to give presentations, and we're partnering with those ambassadors. We're doing trainings on how to conduct interviews, and then they are going to conduct interviews for our projects in language with their community. So this makes sure that people whose voices often go unheard are in a safe space, are with someone who speaks their language and understands their cultural values. So those are 2 examples when we've used the lived experience protocol. Carmen, do you have any other examples you'd like to speak to?
Yeah, I think about a year or 2 ago, I did some work with young people who lived in residential care, and so really big trauma backgrounds. So it was a really sensitive project, and the guidelines, the protocol really helped. It was challenging to implement because it's kind of this really stiff checklist, and you're trying to do, this warm engagement of these young people. And so it is challenging to translate that, and it does require a certain amount of kind of soft skills to translate them. But I think it's this wonderful reminder and always there that I go to, and I'm like, oh, I've forgotten to really be clear exactly about how we're translating this. Or so one of the limitations we had was that by the time we'd engaged these young people, it was towards the end of the project, we'd done a significant amount of research, and they could know that we couldn't incorporate the findings as such, but we did this workshop to help the translation piece to the department, and it really helped with that process because I could say, hey, this is the limitations because I was following the checklist. I was like, these are the limitations of this process. I can't, we won't be changing the world. But it's really valuable to hear what you're saying and to make sure that we're translating this effectively and that your key points are really put at the forefront of this work. So yeah, like I found them super helpful as kind of that background thing, that this is what I need to remember to do, but also to always remember that it's the soft skills in between that bring these things to life.
Yeah, and it makes sure that our staff are doing this in the same way as best as possible to make sure we have some quality control when we over our work. We are right at 11:59. That flew by for me, but it did for you too, Carmen. Thank you everyone who joined us today. If you have questions, you can send emails to info@iscca.com.au. There will be a quick survey that pops up. We'd love to see you at the workshop. We would love to hear how this landed with you all. This is the first time we've presented it. It's been really exciting for us, and we hope that it's helpful for you as well. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.